Hello, and thank you for joining us at this session. We'll be hearing about the challenges that face clinical trials in Parkinson's and how new pioneering initiatives aim to shake up how clinical trials are done. I'm your host, Becky Port, Research Communications Manager at Parkinson's UK, and I'm delighted to be joined by Carroll Siu, a Parkinson's advocate and patient expert, Dr. Camille Carroll, Associate Professor and Honorary Consultant Neurologist at Plymouth University, and our own Professor David Dexter, Associate Director of Research at Parkinson's UK. I'm really looking forward to hearing more and would love to hear from you, so please do leave your comments, thoughts, reflections, anything like that in our chat. And after our main session, our speakers will be live to answer your questions. And if you have any technical issues or just want to catch up on this session afterwards, we'll be recording all this content and it will be available on demand for 30 days after the event. So without further ado, we'll kick off and say hello to our first guest. Hello, Carroll. Can you tell us more about your connection with Parkinson's?
Hello, everyone. I first want to thank Parkinson's UK for inviting me to talk on the subject of clinical trials. And thank you, Becky, for introducing me, but I really don't think I'm a patient expert at all. I prefer to be called an advocate, to be honest. I do represent quite a few Parkinson's group in the south of England, particularly in Kent and East Sussex. And most recently, I've been attending a monthly meeting in Philadelphia in the United States. And these are a group of women of working age that's got Parkinson's. And I got to know the chair of that group through doing a piece of research with her about 3 years ago. But since then, we have remained friends. So it's always interesting to see what is going on across the pond. Professionally, I have taught research methodology before I retired. And of course, with someone that has got Parkinson's, I'm particularly interested in research findings. But I'm also interested in how research is being done as well.
So can you tell us a little bit more about what clinical trials are and why they're important?
Well, clinical trials is a research type or research methodology. And in the research fraternity, clinical trials has always been seen as a gold standard. And the reason for that is because clinical trials generate reliable and valid results, which are supposed to be believable. And believability is very important amongst us in the Parkinson community, because if we believe in the research findings, then we are more likely to take them up. And this might mean trying new drugs or a non-drug therapy, or even making those important lifestyle changes. It's quite important to remember that clinical trials do take years to carry out, especially the discovery of new drugs. And it starts from what they call the preclinical stage. And this is where the molecular structure of the drug or the chemical is scrutinized in the laboratory setting. Then it moves on to the next stage, which is called phase 2, where the drug or the chemical is tested on animals. And finally, in phase 3, the drug or the chemical is tested on humans. The final outcome, or what they call the endpoint, is the production of a new drug, or sometimes a repurposed drug. Repurposed drug is when a drug that has been used for another condition is now used for Parkinson's. Or it can be a non-drug therapy that the researcher or the scientist hopes to produce what they hope as a earth-shattering result. But we must also remember, as people within the Parkinson's community, that in order to produce such a remarkable endpoint or remarkable result, the Parkinson's community needs to be involved in the research. In other words, they need to be prepared to be guinea pigs. There are certain ways where clinical trials are conducted, and you might have heard of the term randomized control trial, or RCT. And this is when two groups of research participants are tested side by side following the same exact procedure, except that one group is given the real drug or the therapy, and the other group a placebo. And a placebo really is a dummy drug, or in some instances, the withholding of a certain therapy. So when you think about it, there is a whole remit of ethical problems that is involved in conducting clinical trials that researchers need to be aware of and also, most importantly, overcome. So hopefully Camille and David will be touching on these a little bit later in their discussion.
So in order for a treatment to be approved, it has to go through a trial?
Well, yes, definitely, because people in the Parkinson's community needs to be reassured that treatments are safe and it's been through rigorous testing. And there are certain gatekeepers who ensure that treatments are ready for production by the pharmaceutical companies and ready for prescribing by professionals such as doctors and therapists. In the UK, one example of such gatekeeper is the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Product Regulatory Authority. But just to give you some example of these treatments that have been on the market for quite a few years, and also some examples of treatments that's been trialed at the moment, I'm going to follow those three categories, starting with the first category, which are the drugs. And I'm sure a lot of you would have been familiar with the drug Sinemet, which is the trade name for levodopa-carbidopa. Believe it or not, Sinemet as the chemical was first recognized in the late 1960s, but it's not until 1988 where Sinemet was mass-produced and available for consumption by people with Parkinson's. Just to give you also an example of a drug that has been trialed at the moment and supported by Parkinson's UK is that of CBD, or cannabidiol, which is the active substance in the hemp plant or the cannabis plant. And researchers are trying to discover whether CBD is useful for motor and non-motor symptoms, like muscle spasms, and also anxiety and lack of sleep. Examples from the non-drug therapy group. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the term DBS, or deep brain stimulation. Well, that has been going on for quite a few decades now. And recently, they have actually moved into the fourth generation format. An example of the non-drug therapy that's being trialed at the moment, again supported by Parkinson's UK, is that of the vagus nerve stimulation. And the researchers are hoping to use a device that's placed at the neck to stimulate the vagus nerve. And again, this is to help with improving both motor and non-motor symptoms. So it'll be very interesting to see how that works. The last group is the group on lifestyle therapies. And as we all know, exercise is a very important activity that helps with our motor symptoms. And researchers has also discovered recently that exercise helps with our mental and social well-being as well. An example of a lifestyle therapy that's being trialed at the moment and supported by Parkinson's UK is the use of probiotics in order to improve the gut microbiome. And the whole idea is the researchers is looking at how probiotics can boost the immune response within our body and hopefully slow down the progression of Parkinson's.
That sounds great, really good examples there, Carol. But we all know that trials aren't always successful. Why do you think that is?
Well, trials that fall by the wayside are primarily due to inconclusive results. And the reasons behind this are multiple. And this could range from a small sample size, for example, whereby there's not enough participants, or it can be due to lack of resources, such as funding, or it could be due to a poor design, whereby the clinical trial procedure were not followed rigorously. But one thing to draw your attention to, there's one very important reason that clinical trials fall by the wayside is because these trials are conducted over a contracted period of time. And this produces issues because, as you all know, the Parkinson's conditions do wax and wane, and our progression do differ between one individual to another. And this is an absolute nightmare for researchers because in regards to measuring patients' symptoms, they find it extremely difficult to capture changes at any one time. So hopefully Camille and David will enlighten us by addressing some of these issues later.
And I know you yourself, you've been involved in various clinical trials and are still. Can you tell me about your experiences of taking part in clinical research?
Yes, of course. Personally, I have participated in both in-person and online research, particularly since the lockdown, and also both cross-sectional and longitudinal research. Cross-sectional being a research that's carried out as a one-off occurrence. Longitudinal is a piece of research that's carried out over a long period of time, and data is being collected at intervals. I find it extremely interesting to be a guinea pig, to be honest, because I can actually gain first-hand experiences which I can share with other people within the Parkinson's community. And also there's an added bonus because when I'm involved with research, I'm amongst very knowledgeable researchers. And I also use that opportunity to quiz them about my condition.
And if you were talking to somebody who might be thinking of taking part in a clinical trial for the first time, what advice would you give them?
Well, my advice really is to find a piece of research that is of interest to you. And also, very importantly, to weigh up impacting factors such as accessibility. Can you travel to the place where the research is being conducted? Are there other researchers keen to help you and assist you with your disabilities? Are they able to reimburse the costs like travel? And most importantly, have you got the time? Because you need to find out whether the research is done as a one-off occurrence, or is it conducted over a period of time at several intervals. But my final word is, please don't hesitate. Go on to the Parkinson's Take Part Hub and have a look online what is available for you, because you can type in your postcode and find out pieces of research that is near you and accessible to you and suit the ones that suits you. And if you haven't got online facilities, you can always ring the Parkinson's UK helpline, and there'll be somebody there that can talk you through some interesting pieces of work. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Carol. And yes, we'll try and get those links up as this chat is happening, but we can also find resources in the Take Action part of our website. So if you're looking for the Take Part Hub, do have a look there. You should find a link. So we've heard a little bit about what clinical trials are and why they're important, and those challenges that Carol mentioned about the size of clinical trials, the time that they go on, all these things that cause issues when it comes to actually carrying out trials and getting that definitive answer that at the end of the day, does this treatment work, or is it better than a placebo? That's what these clinical trials are aiming to achieve. So we'll be talking to Dr. Camille Carroll now, who knows all about these challenges in Parkinson's research, and she can tell us about the ACT-PD trial that is looking to completely change up how we are doing clinical trials at the moment, making them more efficient and more effective. So Camille, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Becky. Really nice to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. So I'm going to be telling you about the Edmund J. Safra Accelerating Clinical Trials in Parkinson's initiative, which is a new project that we're very excited to be starting and to be sharing with you today. My name's Camille Carroll, and I'm a neurologist based in Plymouth. I'm going to tell you a bit about trials and what makes them hard to do, and then how we think this initiative, the EGS Act PD initiative, provides a potential solution, and how it is not without challenges itself. I'm just going to touch on this, that this initiative, a new way of delivering trials in Parkinson's, does sit within a broader vision for delivering research in the UK, but excuse me, not just in Parkinson's, of course, but for all conditions. And the vision very much is that from the moment of diagnosis, everyone with Parkinson's should have the opportunity to take part in a study that answers important questions about their care, and that should be irrespective of the age, gender, ethnicity, geographical location, or healthcare provider. And I just wanted to make that point as we're coming out of COVID, because if ever we needed an example of why inclusive research was so important, it's the COVID pandemic and the lessons that we've learned from that, and also the delivery of research within the context of COVID. So what do you need for a trial? Well, you need several key ingredients for a trial. First of all, you need trial participants. You need to have a therapy that you're going to test to see whether it works. You need to design your study, work out excuse me, what you're going to do and who you're going to have in your study. You need to have something that you're going to measure and a robust way of measuring it. You need to have infrastructure in the places that you're going to deliver the study, the workforce that you need, or any bits of kit to do the measurements that you want. And very importantly, you need to make sure that if you have a positive finding of your study, that it translates into benefit for patients or the people with the condition that you're trying to improve. Because if you don't plug that gap, then your positive study will land nowhere and be of no benefit to anyone. When we do trials, they go through several phases, and you'll have heard a bit about this before. So there's a preclinical phase, which is generally conducted in the laboratory, and will bring forward compounds or drugs or molecules that might be of interest to test in people. The phase 1 studies generally involve a few participants and take a few months, and this is first in human studies, checking that those drugs are safe in people and they're not causing any untoward or unexpected side effects. Drugs then enter phase 2 studies, which is where we look to see whether there's any signal of benefit in a particular disease. And so for our purposes, we're talking about Parkinson's disease, and we're particularly interested in the work that we're doing in slowing Parkinson's, stopping or reversing progression. So we're looking to see, is there any signal that this particular drug might work in people with Parkinson's? And generally that can be 50 to 100 or maybe even 200 participants. These numbers are a bit optimistic here, I think, but these studies can also take quite a long time. A phase 2 study can take 3 to 5 years to read out, depending on how long it is. Phase 3 studies then confirm that positive signal and show that that positive signal did translate into meaningful benefit for the person with Parkinson's. These are, again, much bigger studies. They take longer to do. They can involve multiple centres, sometimes multiple countries. So in order to get to this point here at the end of phase 3, where a drug might get a license to be used, can take easily up to 20 years. And just this clinical bit can take 10 to 15 years. So this is a really slow process from first having the idea about a drug to getting it licensed at the end of a phase 3 study. And if we look at our track record for disease-modifying therapies, those are therapies that slow, stop, or reverse Parkinson's, our track record is not great. The phase 2 studies, those initial signal studies, are the brown boxes here, and the phase 3 studies are the yellow boxes, and the red crosses, as I'm sure you can guess, are all the studies that didn't work. These are all the drugs that did not have a positive outcome. And The other thing that you can see from this graph is that there is generally quite a long pause between the end of a phase 2 and the start of a phase 3. So this will be where a drug company or whoever is taking forward this drug has gone to a funder or an investor and said, look, I've got a positive result. I'd like to take it forward into a much bigger study. And of course, that needs funding, it needs setting up, it needs designing. So this whole process is very inefficient. And you can see how it does span the decades to get from the beginning of phase 2 to the end of phase 3. So we've got a problem, but the trouble is we don't really know what's causing it. So is it that we're choosing the wrong people to take part in our studies? Are we not selecting participants correctly or intelligently enough? Maybe none of those therapies that we've chosen has been correct, and it's fine that they were all negative because they weren't good drugs. Maybe our trial design isn't good enough for the purpose. Maybe we're measuring the wrong thing, and we do know how hard it is to measure Parkinson's progression, so I'm sure part of the problem sits here. Maybe we don't have appropriate infrastructure for trial delivery, and we know that trial delivery is slow at sites. We know recruitment is slow. Quite a lot of trials never recruit the number of patients that they need, and that's possibly to do with the infrastructure that's available for trial delivery, and always being mindful that we do need to have this pathway to impact. Here's a quote from Ben Stetcher, whom some of you will know is a really powerful Parkinson advocate. And I really like the way he's phrased this, that despite the whirlwind of research and translational studies which flood the pages of journals, the Parkinson's community continues to wait, acknowledging a growing element of skepticism that the pace of novel advance seems to be slowed down by a system that cannot move fast enough to keep pace with degeneration. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at how can we be doing things differently to overcome some of the barriers that we face. So we think one of the ways of looking at it differently is to set up trials in a different way. And this is called a multi-arm, multi-stage trial platform. And the way that this works is that in a multi-arm trial, you have several treatments that are tested at the same time. You're not doing them each individually. And in a multi-stage trial, you don't have that separation between your phase 2 study and your phase 3 study. You bring those together, and what you do is you recruit right at the very beginning to a phase 3 study. So you assume that all of these drugs, and in this example there are 4 active drugs against a placebo, all of those drugs are going to run for a five-year or 3-year phase 3 study, but you plug into your design some sort of interim measure, which is a threshold or go, no-go point at which drugs get pulled if they don't meet that criterion. And that way you ditch the arms that aren't working early. The ones that might have promise, you keep those going, but you don't lose all of this input from those first patients who enrolled in the study. They keep going and the whole thing becomes a lot more efficient. And the other advantages of this is that you can screen through compounds a lot more quickly. You've got much less patients on placebo, and you get to your phase 3 outcome a lot quicker. So in this infographic, the phase 3 outcome is reached for this drug at 5 years, whereas in the old model, this would have been 10 years or maybe even 15 years. And you can see that at the end of 5 years, as well as having one compound through to phase 3, there have also been 8 compounds who didn't meet that first criteria, which have been screened out, and that's just as valuable information. So this is a much more efficient way of delivering studies. But of course, that doesn't get around all of the challenges that I alluded to earlier. So thinking that this was a good idea for Parkinson's to design a MAMS trial, we appreciated that we had some homework to do. So we spent a lot of time talking to people who've done this in other disease areas, and that includes other neurological conditions. There is a MAMS trial now in motor neurone disease called MND SMART. There's one in multiple sclerosis called Octopus, and we've spoken to the teams that have designed those studies. Plus the teams who have designed the first MAMS trials, which are generally cancer trials. The longest running MAMS trials are in prostate cancer, and the team involved in designing that study is at the MRC Clinical Trials Unit, one of the partners in our work. We've also done some background work, or are doing some background work, I should say. We're undertaking a scoping review of all the neuroprotective trials that have been undertaken, that are published in the literature, to see what are the common design choices in terms of the patients recruited, or the duration of the trial, or what's measured to determine whether a drug works. And importantly, we've also undertaken a Delphi process, which is a survey process to see if there's consensus that can be reached about the best way of designing a trial. And these bits of preliminary work, the scoping review and the Delphi process, have been funded by Cure Parkinson's. And what we're doing in our initiative, that I'll tell you a bit more about in a moment, is we're setting up some working groups. And the idea is that by Q1 2024, we will have a funded trial protocol to launch our first MAMS trial. So a Delphi process is a process whereby you ask people questions. What sort of people should we enroll in the study? How should we measure Parkinson's? You ask different stakeholder groups. So that would be people with Parkinson's, their care partners, industry representatives, clinical scientists, funders, and everyone answers those questions. And then the facilitator looks at all those answers and then feeds them back to all the participants, again in the second round. So the next time you vote on that question, you have the benefit of seeing how other people rank to response, and then you can modulate your answer if you wish. And in that way, you can start to achieve consensus. And we conducted an international Delphi process with people representing each of these groups: people with Parkinson's, carers, scientists, funders, industry, and the regulators. And the idea of the Delphi process was to try and come to an agreement on how a clinical trial could be designed, find out where actually there was agreement and we can nail that decision, and where more discussion is needed. And I'm going to show you some of the findings from that Delphi process as we go through. So earlier this year, we were very fortunate to receive funding from Edmund J. Safra Foundation to launch the EJS Act PD initiative. And this is an initiative that I'm co-leading with colleagues at UCL, Professor Tom Fultony and Professor Sonia Gandhi. And as I mentioned, this is in collaboration with the MRC Clinical Trials Unit and the Queen Square Movement Disorder Centre. And as part of the consortium, what we've done is we've set up 6 working groups mapping to each of the areas of necessity for delivering a trial. So we've got a working group looking at trial design, outcome measures, therapy selection, infrastructure, stakeholder engagement, and patient engagement. And we have somebody with Parkinson's or a care partner, two people on each of these working groups, to make sure that the voice of people with Parkinson's and care partners really comes through in the design. And importantly, we also have in each of the working groups what's known as an early career researcher. So these are the clinical academics of the future, because of course we want this to be a successful platform that will run and allow compounds and drugs and therapeutics to continue to be tested for protection in Parkinson's until we've found a solution. And then each of our working groups is supported by appropriate multi-professional experts. So the most important group is our patient engagement group, and that is chaired by Kevin McFarlane. And what Kevin's group is doing is making sure that the patient voice really does feed through into trial design in a way that is impactful, and we're working out processes by which that impact can be evaluated. And the group is also tasked with making sure that the Parkinson's community has got awareness and understanding of the project. And as I say, really making sure that we measure the impact and work out how to maximise benefits so that we can translate that into future studies involving patients. The Trial Design Working Group is co-chaired by Professor Roger Barker, who I'm sure you know works in Cambridge, and Professor James Carpenter, who's a statistician at the MRC Clinical Trials Unit, who actually was involved in those first multi-arm, multi-stage platform trials. And what the Trial Design Working Group is tasked with doing is working out who should take part in this study, whether it will be a trial for everyone, which is currently the aspiration, or whether there's a need to just choose for particular therapies. We might want to choose people with particular genotype, for example, people who have the glucose 3-phosphidase gene mutation. So there are different ways that we can think about selecting participants, and that will be their job. They also need to think about whether it's important to distinguish a disease-modifying effect from a symptomatic effect, which can be quite tricky. So is the drug just helping symptoms, or is it actually slowing progression? And is it important to know that? So again, that's a question for them. We have access to some data sets from Critical Path that I think you're going to hear more about later. And of course, an important part of this trial design working group will be to plan the analysis. The Delphi process addressed this issue of inclusion criteria and who should take part in the study. And there's a balance to be struck between making sure that your initial trial group, the people taking part in the study, are as similar as possible. So you've got the best chance of seeing if there's a signal, but also if your trial is successful, you need to make sure that the results of that trial are as widely applicable as possible. They shouldn't just be applicable to a really niche number of patients. We want as many people as possible to benefit from any therapeutic that we find. So in terms of the Delphi process, there was consensus that the trial should not just be targeted at people who have not yet started therapy. And of course, these days, a lot of therapeutics will only include people who have not yet started any Parkinson's therapy, and we did not think that consensus was reached that this was not appropriate. However, no consensus about these other inclusion criteria, that whether there's an upper age limit or a lower age limit or disease duration. So these are things that the trial design working group are going to have to thrash out. And of course, the voice of the patient here is very important. Therapy selection is chaired by Professor Tony Shapiro. And the treatment selection working group will be selecting initially drugs for the trial, but I should say, although I've used the word drugs, will be broader than that, and there will be other potentially therapeutic interventions such as exercise, which is already being trialled. Some nutrient supplements, for example, might come to the fore. So it isn't just drugs, but excuse me, that this therapeutic selection group will be looking at. It will be broader, and they will be thinking about how many arms is it sensible to have, how can we get a control group for the arms, and how long should people be on treatment for. And of course that might vary depending on what the intervention is. And some of these questions were addressed in the Delphi process, and generally people all agreed that there should be a placebo control as opposed to a standard of care control, and that there should be multiple arms. But the role of a standard care arm wasn't entirely clear. And you can see if the intervention being tested is an exercise program, for example, it isn't really clear whether there is a placebo for that or whether standard of care could be a valid control. In terms of treatment duration, again, there's a balance to be struck between finding the biggest possible difference between a control group and a treatment group. And so you want your curves to diverge over time. So the longer you run the study, the greater your chance you'd hope of picking up a difference. But of course, we don't want to wait forever. We want answers now. We want to run our trials in the shortest amount of time. So there was no consensus here about what the bigger driver of those two was. So the treatment duration question remains open. The outcome measure working group is chaired by Professor Annette Schrag, and Annette certainly has her work cut out for her, because as yet we have not had a trial which has shown a protective effect for people with Parkinson's, and we don't know how to measure that. But we do know that this outcome measure that we use at the end of that big phase 3 study has got to be something that's meaningful to people with Parkinson's. So it's not just going to be a UPDRS score of tapping tasks. And Annette's group will also have to identify those interim measures where we cut out arms at the end of 18 months or whatever that's decided to be. And of course, her work is made more difficult by not having a biomarker in Parkinson's that we can easily measure. So the outcome measures, on the whole, there was agreement that we all wanted outcome measures to be holistic and really give a good impression of how someone's Parkinson's is affecting their lives, and not just focusing on one thing. But the balance to be struck here is between measuring Parkinson's in a comprehensive way without making it completely burdensome for participants that are filling out rating scales and e-diaries every day of the year. So there is a balance to be struck, and that will take some working through. Stephen Mullin chairs the infrastructure working group. He's a colleague of mine here in Plymouth. And Stephen's working group is going to ensure that there is trial delivery infrastructure across the whole of the UK, that wherever someone with Parkinson's is, that they will have easy access to a site with appropriately skilled staff to deliver this for them. And of course, this means that we need to have a way of finding people with Parkinson's. So he's going to be developing a research register, and we want to make sure that the site staff have got the adequate skills to measure Parkinson's in whichever way a next group decides that needs to be done. And we also need to be mindful that we want to likely plug in remote visits, and that all the study does not just require face-to-face visits in a clinic environment to make the study more accessible. And importantly, it is important that we do have a culture of trial participation in clinical services so that people are offered the opportunity to take part in this study. Very last working group is Joy Duffin, who chairs the funding and stakeholder engagement. And Joy's task is to get over these two death valleys here, which are converting that basic research into the first trial, which is mainly a funding question. And then if there is a positive response found, that we get that into practice and policy, that we engage with the people that we need to engage with to really pack that punch. So Joy will be working with funders, regulators, MHRA, NICE, NHS England, charities, to make sure that any response that we find in our trial will be translated through into practice quickly. So our EJS ACT-PD initiative looks at each of these core components of how to deliver a successful trial for Parkinson's. And I just want to end by coming back to Ben's comment and hoping that we have at least redesigned the system that will allow for faster delivery of therapeutics. Thank you for your attention. Sorry, it was a very quick whiz through. This is Simon Stott's blog, Science of Parkinson's, which is excellent and covers the whole concept of a MAMS trial very eloquently, probably more eloquently than I've just articulated. And I just want to thank Marie, who conducted the Delphi survey with her project group. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille, for sharing this pioneering work. Speeding up the delivery of new treatments certainly is high on everyone's agenda, and ACT-PD is such an important role in doing just that. But trial design is just one way that we can improve clinical trials. And next up, we have Professor David Dexter to talk about a global initiative called Critical Path for Parkinson's that aims to make the most or make clinical trials more successful. David, hello, how are you doing?
Hi there, Becky. I'm very well. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today.
Thanks. Can you tell us what Critical Path is and what it aims to do?
Well, the Critical Path for Parkinson's is truly an international initiative. So it combines the sort of the skills and the data from 15 pharmaceutical companies. We've got 6 other Parkinson's charities working with us, numerous academic institutions, and more importantly, the drug regulators are also working with us as well. So what we're doing is combining patient-level data to really generate new tools that will allow us to plan more effective clinical trials. And so in the end, really, what we're able to do then is identify drugs, which can slow Parkinson's much quicker. And this is really being led by our partners, which are based in Arizona. So this is the Critical Path Institute, and these are experts in the field, and they've been doing similar sort of paths for Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis. So they are the experts in the field.
I see where the name comes from, Critical Path in Arizona. So which studies and trials have agreed to share their data with this initiative? And how many people with Parkinson's does it involve?
So currently the database has got about 13,500 people with Parkinson's data in it. And so these have come from multiple sources, some of which have been funded by Parkinson's UK. So these include some of the large longitudinal cohorts. For example, Tracking Parkinson's, which involves about 2,500 people with Parkinson's across the whole of the UK. So these people have been followed for up to about 9-10 years now. So all of their data has gone into the database. Also, the Oxford Parkinson's Discovery Cohort, again, about 1,200 people with Parkinson's in the Thames Valley area. Also includes Icicle is another one, which was in Cambridge and in Newcastle. So a real broad brush of studies across the whole of the UK. Also, there's the Michael J. Fox initiative, the PPMI initiative as well. That's included in there. But importantly, we've got data from about 20 really large clinical trials. So these have been run probably over the last 15 years. And even though these trials have failed, all of the data from these trials is really important and is being donated into the database.
Yeah, it's great to hear that all these different studies, the data can be used again in such a way. But obviously the critical path of Parkinson's, they must be using quite a lot of expertise to take data from different studies that have been set up and done in different ways. Is that part of what they're doing?
Yeah, this is why the experts in the area, because you may not believe this, but even just for registering somebody's sex, whether they're male or female, there's 9 different ways of doing it in clinical trials. And so what they're doing is harmonizing all the data together. So one of the big things that the Critical Path Institute are good at is harmonizing all the data. So they harmonize all of the data to the same types of variables, so you can compare across the different trials and the different cohort studies. So that's one of the big challenges that they have to do, is to harmonize a new study coming in. And that really does take up a lot of manpower and a lot of computing power to do all that. But these people are the experts in the field for doing this.
So the initiative is all about using and learning from the data we already have to make better choices when it comes to how we carry out future trials. Can you give us an example of how this works?
Yeah, that's correct, Becky. And as Carroll has already pointed out, that most Parkinson's trials involve half of the population of people taking the active drug and half of the population taking the placebo or the dummy drug. So what you want to do is run the trial for a sufficient period of time. So let me just say my hand is just like the Parkinson's group taking the active drug. We want the drug to slow their Parkinson's down, whereas the placebo group will gradually keep getting worse, going upwards with their Parkinson's immobility. But the question is, how long do you run these trials for until you can see a difference between the placebo and the active drug arm? And at the moment, doctors running trials have no tools to help them to predict how long to run the trial for. And so this is based on existing evidence. So looking at particular symptoms of Parkinson's, they think it should run for a certain period of time. But the problem is that if you don't run it for long enough, you won't see a big enough difference between the placebo group and the active treatment group. And so this could cause the trial to potentially fail. And obviously you don't want to run it for too long, because you're giving people with Parkinson's experimental treatments, and if they aren't producing any clinical benefit, then we should stop them as soon as possible. And also, if you run them longer, then they become more costly. So the idea behind this project is for the first time to give them a tool that they can say that if we're looking at these particular symptoms in this particular group of people with Parkinson's, we need to run it for X number of months, before we would expect to see a significant difference between the placebo group, who should be getting worse, and the group on the active drug, who should be either stable in their Parkinson's or improving. So that is a big challenge at the moment, and nobody can help you with that. But these tools are going to be available globally. They're going to be approved by the regulators, the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration in America, and the European Medicines Agency. Both of those are going to improve the tools. So anybody, whether you're in India or Australia planning a trial, you'll be able to use these tools, really.
So that sounds like it's going to make a huge difference to how clinical trials are conducted in the future. So what does this mean ultimately for a person with Parkinson's, say they're at home today? What change will this make for them?
I think what it was, everybody wants a treatment that slows or reverses Parkinson's. And the quicker that we can get to that, the better for everybody. And really, having these tools will allow us to run these trials efficiently. So if the trial fails, we know it will be the drug that's failed. And not the trial structure. So this tool will allow us to give a really efficient trial design so that if a trial fails, we know it's the drug and not for the reason we haven't run it long enough. So that will actually allow us to speed the whole process up of identifying a drug which will actually slow Parkinson's for the first time.
That sounds amazing, David. And I heard that Critical Path Parkinson's, they're also interested in digital technology as well.
That's correct, Becky. So, we realised right at the very beginning, we didn't need to just fix the trial design problem. We needed to fix the problem about how we assess Parkinson's in an individual. So currently in clinical trials, as Carroll has talked about, they're involving clinical assessments. So during the trial period, you'll go to the clinical centre running the trial and a doctor will examine you, and that is a clinical examination. And unfortunately, that is just a snapshot in time, so about a 20-minute example, and it really doesn't reflect how the person's Parkinson's is affecting them over the last perhaps month or even the rest of the day. And also, it's in a hospital setting. So really what we want to do is design drugs which help people in their homes. And that's really where digital technology could really come into play. So these are wearable sensors that can be on the wrists. They could also be placed on the lower back, or they could be actually on your mobile phones. So your smartphone is truly smart these days. So it can sit in your pocket and it can measure how you're moving around the house, how you're moving around when you're going out shopping, or you can actually do clinical tests on there. So all of those tests that you do when you go and see the neurologist or your Parkinson's nurse specialist, most of those you can actually do on a smartphone now. So the idea is that we can actually capture more reliably how Parkinson's is affecting you and whether the drug is actually having a positive effect or not. So what we're doing at the moment through Critical Path is actually trialing out some of these digital technologies and then showing the data to the drug regulators. So if we can convince the regulators that these can assess Parkinson's properly, then we can use them in clinical trials. And again, this will speed up the detection of a drug which can slow Parkinson's.
That sounds absolutely amazing, David, and truly a new way of doing things. I guess that's really it. That's what we need to do, is figure out how to make clinical trials as effective as possible, and hearing all these different collaborators from all over the world working together, using that data that's already been made available to actually change the future of trials. It's really very inspiring. So thank you so much. So now we're going to hand over to a couple of questions that were asked by our volunteer team. Laurel, I know you had a question.
You were talking about the fact that Critical Path will help make sure that the method there are no concerns about future methodology and about the endpoints. But what about do they ever run trials where they don't have sufficient people with Parkinson's to make it statistically? Do we know now when we run a trial how many people we need to include to make sure that the results are acceptable?
Yeah, so what happens in the trial design, you have to do what's called a power calculation. And so this is looking at the types of symptoms that you're going to examine. And, even sort of blood tests and things like that. And they work out, how many patients do we need to run in each arm of the study, in order to see a significant difference, and that is based on previous data. So some of the drug companies are tapping into the database and the progression models that we've got already. And using the database, they're actually planning their trials now. Even we've submitted the models to the regulators. Unfortunately, COVID has knocked us back a bit on this. But drug companies are already using the models already. One of the ones is there's a gene mutation causing Parkinson's called LRRK2. And they've been doing a trial in LRRK2 subjects. And in the critical path database, they showed that the LRRK2 people progress slower than idiopathic or sporadic Parkinson's. So that was really useful in their trial design, because then they knew that they had to run it for longer. So the database and the models are really being used already in better planning and design, even though they haven't been fully approved by the regulators yet.
Another question has just occurred to me. What we want to get out of this conference is selling the idea of people with Parkinson's taking some responsibility and helping their own journey by exercising, eating well, socialising, etc. But how do you take that into account in the populations of clinical trials if some of the people on the trial are doing all those things and therefore potentially improving their situation, their symptoms, and it may not be to do with the drug they're testing?
Yeah, so that is, they do look at potential confounding factors. So diet is probably not going to play too much of an effect, but quite a lot of trials now are actually monitoring exercise levels. So they're trying to sort of balance out the groups as well. So you can have these fancy computer programs which will randomize people within a trial. So it will balance the numbers of people who are exercising more than others. So you can get a balance of people in each arm of the trial as well. So there's some really sophisticated ways that you can actually randomize people now.
Thank you, Laurel. And thank you, David. So, Carroll, are there any other technologies that you think may change the way clinical trials are being done?
Because of what's been done with stem cells at the moment, actually using pluripotent cells, you can actually work on these neurons in a petri dish, and so you can actually see how the chemicals react to them outside the body. So I'm sure it will help to speed things up too. Am I right, David?
Yes, certainly. That's one of the prerequisites of, if we're considering a virtual biotech project, they must have had to show that these drugs are effective in patient-derived cells. So they are, playing a major role there. But one of the biggest stumbling blocks is actually getting people motivated into trials. So there are so many drugs coming through at the moment that probably the numbers of volunteers are going to be ultimately the limiting factor.
Thank you so much for your time, everyone. Really very inspiring session, and it would be great to see what other people think of that. And again, if you're looking for the Take Part Hub, you can find that in the Take Action section of the website. And we do hope that people will take part in research and, as David said, help with one of the biggest challenges, which can be just finding people to take part in all this clinical research. And there certainly seems to be a lot of clinical research on the horizon. So thank you so much for joining us. Hi Hi, thank you for joining this live session, and I'm very pleased to invite back David Dexter, who you've heard from, and with us we have Tom Faulkney, who's a consultant neurologist and professor of neurology at the National Hospital of Neurology and Neurosurgery, and is a co-PI on the EJS ACT PD trial. And of course, I should have said the Edwin J. Safra ACT PD trial in that recording. So I'm very pleased to open the floor to our live questions and start us off. Tom, can you talk us through, do you try and have patients involved from the very start and in the development of all trials? Are there any types of trials where you wouldn't use patient involvement?
So we're very well aware of how critically important this is, and for our ACT PD project, we have at the centre the patient working group, and this comprises 11 people who have Parkinson's disease or are carers for people with Parkinson's disease, and some additional people who work closely to ensure that PPI interests are adequately represented. And what we're doing is we're making sure that each of our other working groups are not separated from this PPI group. The PPI members go and sit in on every one of the working groups and can influence the decisions, not only giving feedback, but inputting into the very ideas as they're born and as they're developed. So we know how important this is, and what we're going to do is an exercise in looking at the impact of this working group on how the plans evolve. So not just pay lip service to patients being involved, but to document how the patient group does change and the evolution of the process. And so we can publish a study showing how important and what difference it makes having patient interest and patient input and involvement from the very start. I'm sure there will be situations where having patient involvement is less important, and that most of those will relate to basic science research. But as soon as you move into the clinical trial scenario, where a patient is going to be exposed to something new and innovative, you can't get away from taking the views of the participants into account. And I think that's the message we want to give to people.
And David, do you have any comments for trials outside of the ACT PD?
Yeah, so certainly at Parkinson's UK, patient involvement is critical to everything we do. So we've got patient involvement on our grants panel. So when we're funding any clinical study, they have an influence on saying whether this is research which is beneficial to people affected by Parkinson's. And also we've got 3 clinical trials funded through the Virtual Biotech program. And we've had patient involvement in all 3 of those trials, right from identifying whether this is a worthwhile study, right to helping design the protocol. So it's essential that we do involve patients right from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I guess that helps make sure that research is relevant and meaningful. So next up, we have a question from Colin. Are there lessons that could be learnt and adopted from the accelerated developments of COVID vaccines? I'm going to go again to you, Tom.
Yes, so there's a clear demonstration that you can set up trials very, very quickly when circumstances demand that something is done in an emergency. And we want to use this type of platform approach. The recovery trial for COVID was a platform approach, very similar to what we're trying to do in Parkinson's disease. We want to use this setting, which means that new agents can be added in, and if futile, they're discounted and something else takes its place without having to start afresh and get permission and define your population. So this precedent that the recovery trial for COVID has given us is enormously valuable, and it's something that we're going to exploit and use to its full effect. The other thing that we have to remember is during COVID, we couldn't get potentially vulnerable people coming to see us in clinical trial settings, on repeated basis, because that's exposing people to risk. And during our ongoing exenatide trial, we did have to do some remote visits, assessing people via things like Zoom and Teams. and making sure that drugs are dispensed and they're delivered via couriers to the right place at the right time. And so this pandemic has taught us a lot about how we can conduct ourselves in clinical trials in the future, and we will and are learning those lessons.
And David, anything to add on?
Yeah, I was just going to say, because, it was not only rapid setting up of trials, it was rapid approval of the drugs, and it was all around data sharing. So they were sharing data with the regulators live. So as soon as the data closed and they started to do the analysis, the regulators were approving these vaccines because they've been looking at the data all the way along. So it really does emphasize the importance of data sharing, and that's something that's really key to Parkinson's UK. We want to share the data from any of the studies that we fund as widely as possible.
So we have one from Neil. I've seen results of trials influenced by the placebo effect. How can we reduce this influence? Tom, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's an inevitable placebo effect. As soon as someone participates in a trial and they have more people looking at them, talking about their illness with them, giving them additional advice just about how best to cope with balance, turning, walking, then their illness can improve. So it's not just a placebo effect. There's a benefit of being in a trial just because you get additional help and attention. And then if you believe a drug is going to work, then you do get that placebo effect and you do feel better. We need to try and make sure that we don't just observe a placebo deciding if a new intervention is helpful. So having the placebo group, so a control group who are not given an active drug, are absolutely vital looking at the comparison between two groups. So we not only see a placebo effect, we see the additional benefit of an active intervention. And so the ACT-PD trial will be a placebo control to make sure we take account of that.
Thanks, Tom. And I'm going to have to wrap up with the last one. Now, we've already touched on the importance of involvement, but going back to that, how can people with Parkinson's ensure that research is relevant, not conducted out of curiosity, something that needs to be done for a sponsor or a shareholder? Like, what one thing would you recommend people go out and investigate so that they can actually make sure that they're having their voice heard? David, I'll go to you first.
Well, it's joining Parkinson's UK. So Team Parkinson's, come and have your say about what we fund. We have people who are specially trained to help out clinicians design their protocols. There's lots of avenues of which patients can have a voice about what is actually funded, but also the design of trials and things like that. And Tom will have a similar thing for the ACT-PD project as well.
Exactly that. That our treatment selection working group will look at the scientific rationale, and we're trying to find drugs which slow down the rate of progression of Parkinson's, or ideally reverse the progression of Parkinson's disease. But alongside that, we have to think about the patient voice, what the priorities are from their perspective in terms of oral versus injection versus, even more invasive approaches, and the safety, the tolerability, and how acceptable those things might be. So having the voice of the patient working group early on will influence how the treatment selection prioritize which agents to take further.
And if people are interested in getting in touch with you to be part of that?
So what we want is a registry of people that have signed up. Our infrastructure are organising this, and there will be some basic demographics, some contact details, and those types of things. So as and when we have the protocol approved, the regulatory authorities approved, the funding in place, ready to go, then we don't have to then start looking for the first time for participants.
Brilliant. And I'm sure you'll be sharing that with us so we can get it out there to our research support network and beyond. So get more people involved in shaping research. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry that was a very quick Q&A session. I'm now going to hand over for lunch, and it'd be great to see everyone back for our sessions later this afternoon. So thank you again.
Thanks, Becky.